also used to teach social studies here, so it's a little strange coming back to one of my former classrooms. But so it's nice to see some familiar faces and some new faces, and I hope everyone still has some energy left to finish strong. I know over the 2.5 days, a lot can and does happen, and the crisis committee, from what I'm hearing, is doing a lot of great stuff. So before I start, I just need to kind of figure out where you are in terms of the debate. I mean, I heard the update, but you're in 1960. What month? Oh, you're in 64 already? Yeah. So Lumumba's been dead for 3 years, but he's leading this. I'm really confused. He's back from the dead, Walking Dead terrorist leader. Got it. Okay, so it's going to be creative.
I want to know if JFK has been assassinated. That's what I want to know. No?
He's also back from the dead.
Oh, okay.
He and Lumumba are hanging out as undead zombies. Okay. Okay, well, I think some in the room heard me speak yesterday, so forgive me in advance if I have at least a little bit of repetition or overlap, but I think it's important in these things, while the Crisis Committee, I think, is diving very deeply into one slice of the world at one slice of time, I think it's important to back up a little bit and put things into kind of a broader historical context. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the Cold War. That, there are thousands, millions of pages written about the Cold War. I'm not going to try to describe or cover all of it. But I want to give some examples of other things that were happening in other parts of the world leading up to this crisis in the Congo that I think might help sort of understand what was motivating some of the principal actors when I'm talking about, the United States and the Soviet Union. Sort of what was at stake? Why are the U.S. and the Soviet Union even there? Why are they even bothering? And, some would say, well, they didn't really bother that much. It's not the Congo compared to things, other crises in the Cold War, like the Cuban Missile Crisis or Berlin Wall, was not nearly as high profile. It did not push either side, the United States, the Soviet Union, ever to consider escalating to nuclear war. So it wasn't the highest of stakes crises in the Cold War. But as you well know, 100,000, 200,000 at least died in a very short period of time in Congo. So obviously something very important was going on. So I want to back up. So we're in 64. I'll back up to 1940, 45. So it's the end of the Cold War, or end of the World War II. Tens of millions of people have died. Other tens of millions of people are displaced, homeless. Probably 100 million people are really struggling in terms of trying to piece together their societies, their cultures, their cities, their economies. This was truly a kind of global trauma. However, if you were in the Congo, World War II didn't really directly touch you. The Congo was not anywhere near any of the kind of battlefields of World War II. There was a great deal of hope at the end of World War II for, despite whatever enormous calamities and horrific kind of crimes against humanity that had been committed during World War II, there was a high degree of hope that somehow finally the great powers of the world had finally learned their lessons of needing to come together through institutions, through cooperation, through dialogue, through diplomacy. We have the establishment of the United Nations and so on. That didn't last very long, that tremendous hope. And I would say by about 1948, you start to see some pretty strong battles over who's going to be in control in places like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Greece and so on. And then by 1950, the United States, or excuse me, 1949, the Soviet Union tests a nuclear bomb. And this really shakes up not only the United States, but lots of people, because there was sort of this expectation that, okay, the atomic bombs had been dropped in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, but that's so horrible, we have to figure out in this kind of 1945-49 period, how do we manage the atom? How do we kind of put the genie back in the bottle? We never want to see that again. And so when the Soviet Union successfully tests their nuclear weapon in 1949, a lot of this hope kind of goes poof. And it really puts the United States in a panic. And we can, whether that's for good reasons or otherwise, what's going to happen now? And the United States conducted a very high-level kind of grand strategy policy review that produced a famous memorandum called NSC 68, National Security Council Memorandum number 68. They had really cute titles back then. Which was an attempt by the United States to sort of say, well, what do we do now? Right? During World War II, most of you should know that the United States and the Soviet Union were allied together against Nazi Germany and then the Axis powers. After the war, and certainly by 49, wow, it looks like now we are directly clashing with the Soviet Union. So how do we deal with this? And so the United States did this very high-level policy review. They produced a memorandum for President Truman, his National Security Council, called NSC 68, which contains a grand strategy called containment. Okay? And the idea was, wow, we don't want to be in a war with the Soviet Union and communism, but we certainly don't want the Soviet Union and communism to spread and overrun allies of ours or sort of independent, non-aligned countries. We don't want communism and the Soviet Union to get any stronger than it already is. So we need to figure out ways, militarily, diplomatically, economically, politically, to contain them. And part of that policy review process was to look around the world to see where we can't protect everyone at all times. So what are the key places? What are the really important places that we would define as being in our American vital national interests? Vital meaning if they were attacked, we would come defend them. And so around this time, around the same time, the United States and many of its, not all, but many of its European allies had formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, as a mutual defense organization that promised if any one of us is attacked, the rest of us will come to your aid. In response, the Soviet Union, very shortly after, devised the Warsaw Pact. It said, wait a minute, if you guys are going to get together, all right, we're going to get together. Not quite as voluntary an organization, the Warsaw Pact is NATO, but the same idea. If you've got your buddies, then we've got our buddies, and so on. So the United States said, okay, we definitely have our NATO allies, we'll definitely defend them, they're in our vital national interests. But they started looking elsewhere around the world and said, frankly, there are a lot of places in the world that would not be worth it. If they got attacked, we would go send our aircraft carriers and our bombers and our Marines to fight and die to protect them because it's just not that valuable to us, not that threatening. And one of the places they specifically talked about in 1949-48 as part of this review process was the Korean Peninsula. And in 1949, in the north was mostly communist, and the south was mostly kind of, not liberal, but capitalist democracy. There was still kind of a, fairly autocratic. But there were definitely tensions, and the Americans sort of said, we hope Korea, we hope the communists don't win, but we're not really going to put all our chips there. Shortly after they said to themselves, privately, confidentially, we won't defend Korea, the communists attack the South and invade the South, at which point, 4-alarm, fire alarm, oh, we must go defend South Korea. So before the invasion, South Korea is not important. After the invasion, it's critically important. Very bloody war is fought. Oddly enough, this is one of my favorite anecdotes of the Cold War. The United States says, wait a minute, we shouldn't just be fighting this alone. It should be about protecting rights, the sovereignty of South Korea. No country should be invaded. It's about principle. It's not anti-communism. We're going to be protecting sovereignty. It certainly was anti-communism. But in terms of how should we get others on board, they said, we'll take it to the United Nations. And as I may have come up at some point during your discussions, for the United Nations to approve a peacekeeping or a military mission of any kind, it has to be passed by the UN Security Council. There are 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council that have veto powers. Anyone want to name all 5? At the time, it's a tricky one. USA, France, China. Which China?
Chinese China.
Taiwan, the Republic of China. The huge mainland China was not part of the UN Security Council. No. Yeah.
Spain.
No.
UK.
UK and the USSR. So it turns out that the UN Security Council approves a UN force to go fight and repel the communists. Why didn't the Soviet Union veto it? They weren't there. So I don't know what your chairs make you do if you come back late to a session, but can you imagine being the Soviet delegate who came back to the UN Security Council and said, what was vote? What? You had votes? What? They weren't there. Everyone else noticed. All in favor, aye. And it carried. Why didn't China veto it? Because the Chinese communists weren't at the table. They weren't recognized. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang that had escaped to what was Formosa, Taiwan, they were represented, so they vote. So you get an American, Taiwanese, British, and French vote, and the Soviets aren't in the room. Always be in the room. Okay, so that's Korea in 1950. And what happens in the American kind of psyche is South Korea is not important. It's really, really important. Why? Because they think it's important. When we're sitting in the room, right, the National Security Council of Truman, hey guys, what do you think of South Korea? But the second the communists say, we really want South Korea, we got to defend it. If they want it, then we want it. It's like, any of you have little siblings?
If I want something, she immediately want it too.
The toy that they don't play with for 9 months, as soon as you touch it, they'll scream bloody murder. It's mine! Okay? It's not exactly like that. It was...
a Smeagol impression.
Sort of. Now I'm understanding my younger daughter better. Thank you for that. Okay. Well, the Cold War was kind of the dominant story, the dominant game in 1950 and throughout the 50s, but it wasn't the only thing going on. So as I just said, there were lots of parts of the world that really weren't directly touched by World War II, directly in terms of combat and displaced persons and so on. But lots of those parts of the world were undergoing massive changes as well. So in addition to the hope that I talked about before of finally we have this kind of United Nations, we're not going to go to war again, atomic weapons have made war so much more horrific than we ever imagined, that's it, we'll figure out a way to do this. At the same time, ideas had changed about colonialism. And the imperial powers, the Europeans who had colonized huge parts of Latin America and Africa and so on, we can argue whether it was because they were enlightened or they were just too weak or they had changed their mind. For whatever combination of those reasons, there was a recognition that holding colonies was no longer okay. Okay? For thousands of years, the Athenians had colonies. The idea of having a colony made sense for thousands of years. It was nothing particularly 19th century or European about having an empire. China, Russia, building empires, you conquer people and you do whatever you need, the Romans. There's nothing new about establishing an empire. By 1945, though, there was pretty much a consensus, we don't do that anymore. What was unclear was, well, how do you de-empire yourself? What does an uncolonization look like? And it turned out nobody really thought that through. Or more precisely, lots of people had thought about it, and lots of people had very different opinions about how you decolonize yourself. And many of those, as you know, turned violent. Not all of them, but most of them. At some point of we're no longer a colony, we're an independent country, people died in that process. Okay? Some went quickly, some took years, decades to finally become independent. And if we are really honest, if we look at the world today, there are still colonies. One of my favorite trips with my wife was to a place called Aruba. We went scuba diving. We weren't in a country, there is no country called Aruba. We were still, it's a Dutch colony. Yeah, colonies still exist. It's not, so when I said that everyone had agreed that, you don't have, it's not exactly true.
But they exist democratically, don't they? They're voted on that way? I mean, Gibraltar is voted on that way, for example.
I don't think all colonies,
What about Puerto Rico?
I don't think being a colony is the greatest of all tragedies. But I guess my point is, the pendulum had really swung, it didn't go to zero. Right? There are still, we look at the world today, there are still colonies. Slavery existed for thousands of years. By the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, okay, no more slavery. There are still millions of people who are enslaved in the world today. That's just a fact. What's changed is people go through great lengths to deny it, to hide it, to obfuscate, to try to call it something else. No, they're not really slaves, right? Where for thousands of years ago, of course that's my slave. I bought it. It's mine. It's my property.
But there's also a voice and a movement, which they didn't have before.
For sure.
They're not in the same place.
My point is, the norm, the idea, is slavery okay? For sure, is no. There's a kind of universal consensus, slavery is not okay. Does it still exist? Yes, it still exists. So is there a consensus you can't just go conquering people and colonize them? Yes. Does it still exist? Yes, it still exists. Okay. So, I just want to give a couple of examples of what else was going on in some of these places that were decolonizing, as well as some other countries that were going through transitions that both the United States and the Soviet Union both want to say, psst, psst, come join our team, come join our team. Okay? I'm going to look at it a little bit more from the US side just because I'm more familiar with it, but I want you to kind of understand, if I'm talking about how the US, I'm going to try to say, well, how would sort of the other side, how would the Soviets see this in response? How would they kind of interpret it? Okay, so I'll just do a quick run through. I'll try to go, I guess, chronologically. One thing I want you to be listening for as I'm giving these examples is a concept that kind of dominated American strategic thinking in the 50s and into the 60s, and I think with fairly disastrous results. And that was a tendency to look for dominoes, right? If this little thing, this country, this issue, this group, whatever, they're not that significant in and of themselves. But if we don't do anything about them and they tip over, they're going to set off a bunch of dominoes. So this thing is not super important. But we've got to stop it now before it knocks over all the rest. And the story I just told you about South Korea was part of that. If we don't stop the communists now, then they're going to think they can invade and be aggressive anyway. Okay. So, some of the dominoes will be I think, more obvious than others. But in Kenya, in Eastern Africa, which was a colony of the blank empire, British, good. I did know. I wasn't stuck. I just wanted to see if you knew. So Kenya was part of the British Empire. In 1952, there was a rebellion, an uprising, to try to win Kenyan independence. Does anyone know the name of that? The Mau Mau. The British, anyone know how the British responded to the Mau Mau rebellion? Very violently, very brutally, and again, this is overlap to something that I mentioned yesterday. The British instituted a set of concentration camps, and I'm using that term not in the sense of Nazi death camps. They didn't have crematoria, but they basically said, we want to get at the bad guys, so everyone who isn't a bad guy, you're coming with us, and we're going to put you in these camps, so that anyone not in the camps is just automatically a bad guy, and we get to kill them. Now, it turned out, lots of innocent people died under torture and from disease, and there were horrible conditions in these camps. The Mau Mau Rebellion was successfully defeated, at which point the British sort of said, okay, you can have your independence. Not nice. Not nice. We want our independence. Okay, we're going to kill and torture hundreds of thousands of people, and as soon as you quit, then we'll give you your independence. Not nice. Okay. The domino here, I'm going to just give you it here, is in British thinking, if we don't smash this uprising, then our kind of white British settlers all over our colonies all over the world will be in jeopardy. So it wasn't about independence, because as soon as the rebellion is squashed, independence is given. But it's about, you can't attack our citizens who are settling in different parts. Okay. In 1952, also, down the road, in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser leads a military coup, which ironically is kind of supported by the British and the Americans, because King Farouk wasn't really playing nicely with them. Egypt at the time wasn't technically a colony, but the British and the French and the Americans expected King Farouk to do whatever they told him. It was kind of a neo-colonial, you're in charge, but we tell you what to do. And don't touch the Suez Canal. So when Nasser came along and said, hey, I'll play with you guys, they said, okay, you're going to overthrow this King Farouk that we hate? Yes. As soon as he gets in power, Nasser goes, now here's my price tag. I want the best arms, I want money, wait a minute, we could have been dealing with the old guys that you should have thought of. And when the British and the French and the Americans are kind of stalling and not quite sure what to do with him, he goes, really? You're not gonna pay the tab? I think I know who might. Dear Khrushchev, would you be interested in doing business with Egypt? At which point the British and the French said, wait a minute, you dirty double-crosser, whatever. And by 56, we get the Suez Crisis. And the British and the French help Israel launch an invasion of Egypt and think that no one will notice. It's the Israelis. It's not us. Eisenhower, who's the U.S. president by then, not only notices, gets very, very pissed off. Sorry to use a diplomatic term. And smacks down the British and the French, and it doesn't turn out very well for anyone except for Nasser and the Soviets. Right? If you guys look bad, we look good. And this is part of the thinking. So this is the flip side of the domino theory is, well, not flip side, I guess, is the concept of zero sum. If it's bad for you, it's good for us. Okay? which turns out in diplomacy is not the way to go. In trade is not the way to go. There's a difference between competition, which, if properly managed, actually benefits kind of everybody in a freely competitive market, truly freely, without too much regulation, without monopoly. In a freely competitive market, goods get better and cheaper at the same time, at least in theory. It's hard to find truly competitive markets. Okay, 1953, Iran. They have elections. They're democratic elections, free and fair. Mossadegh gets elected. Iran occupies a very strategic chunk of land, a very important chunk of land, where Asia Minor, kind of Southeast Europe, and Africa, Middle East, Persian Gulf, there's lots of oil there. Mossadegh is elected, at which point he says, wait a minute, we have a ton of oil wealth. Who's making money on Iranian oil? Oh, the British. And he says, well, you know, this feels like imperialism. It's our oil that turns into your money. That sounds a lot like you're still treating us like a colony, even though we're not. And Mossadegh starts talking about canceling the leases. Right? The British said, what are you talking about? We have a contract. We have a lease. This isn't colonization. We didn't do it by force. We didn't invade Iran recently. Since you've been elected, just please honor the contract. Mossadegh said, I don't think those contracts, it's time to renegotiate. At which point the British get very worried. And in 1953, the Eisenhower administration has just taken over. Eisenhower has become the new president and has put into positions of power the Secretary of State and the head of the newly formed CIA, two really darling brothers, the Dulles brothers. I don't think they're darling. And the Dulles brothers talk to the British, and the British say, oh, you know, Dulles brothers, we've been reading what you guys have been writing, and we've been listening to your speeches, and we know that you think containment, right? We talked about containment, NSC 68, just make sure the communist world doesn't get any bigger. The Dulles brothers said, that is so weak. That's exactly what that's passive, that's weak, that's what the communists want us to do. Containment's no good, we gotta do rollback. The only thing that the Soviets understand is strength and force. If we talk about containment, if we look weak, if we look passive, they're gonna roll all over. We gotta do rollback. The British go, hey, Dulles brothers, you wanna do rollback? This Mossadegh guy, he's a communist. Yeah. Now, it turns out he really wasn't a communist. He just wanted Iranian oil wealth to benefit Iranians. He wasn't against the free market. He was against kind of neo-imperialism. This is my analysis, and it's debated and so on. Yeah. Yeah.
About 53, which was the rise of Reza Pahlavi.
Yeah.
You mean that it was like democratic election?
There were democratic elections.
Some people consider it as a coup. Why it will not be a coup?
A coup. Well, there is debate over whether the elections involved intimidation. Okay? So, to have a fair democracy, every person is supposed to have a vote, and no one's supposed to be telling them you can or can't vote for this party or this candidate. So it turns out, when the British go to the CIA, the Dulles, I get mixed up which one is Secretary of State and which one's... Alan is CIA, John was State. Okay, now I can remember. They basically start a propaganda campaign, the CIA, a secret one, saying these guys didn't follow the rules, they broke rules, it wasn't a fair vote. And there's a record. I mean, I'm not making this up. We know Kermit Roosevelt, who was the grandnephew, I think, of FDR, something. It was a Roosevelt. The British and the Americans had come up with this plan. We want Mossadegh out because we don't think he's going to protect us. We think he wants to do business with them. We got to get Mossadegh out, and there is a coup then, and the Shah is put in power. So Mossadegh is out. When the Shah is put in power, it is a coup. There's no election really. They bring him back. Okay. What's the domino there? Oil. Oil. Right? So if we lose Iranian oil, right? If we let the Iranians control their own oil, what are the Saudis going to do? What's going to happen to the whole Middle East? We have all these contracts. We need them protected. Okay. I'm going to go very quickly because I want to get into some questions and answers. 1954, we have Vietnam, which it used to be called Indochine, which should give you a hint used to belong to the blank empire? French. Kind of a horrible accent, but it worked. Okay. So Indochine was part of the French Empire. It was a French colony. It had natural resources, rubber, naturalized rubber, and a number of things. The French didn't want to give it up. These pesky Vietnamese, again, thought that things like democracy and individual rights applied to them. Fraternité, égalité, liberté, but not for Vietnamese. So wait a minute. We believe in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, just like you guys do. And Ho Chi Minh, who was one of the leaders of the rebellion, actually went to the United States. I don't mean physically, but he approached the United States and said, look, you guys have been saying since World War II that imperialism is a violation of national rights, group rights, in addition to individual rights. You'll help us get our independence, right? America said, no. What? That's between you and the French. So Ho Chi Minh said, well, if the Americans won't help me, I bet I can find someone else. Soviets, would you like to help us win our independence? And they said, you asked the Americans and they turned you down, right? You can count on us. It's bad for them, it's good for us. Okay. In 1954, there's some of the more experienced colleagues in the room will remember a place, Diem Diem Phu, or reading about, studying up before I was born. But in 1954, the French paratroopers are encircled in a valley in a place called Diem Diem Phu. They were elite paratroopers, and they thought for sure we can hold our base because these guys, these Vietnamese, what are they? The only way they could get at us, these rebels, is if they could put artillery up on all the mountains ringing our little base in the valley. And they can't do that. They don't have roads. They don't have trucks. Turns out that the Vietnamese said, we don't have roads, we don't have trucks, we have bicycles. And they disassembled the artillery, put them on bicycles, pushed them up the jungle path, got them to the top of the mountains, put them back together, and it was like a turkey shoot. And the French actually requested that the United States use atomic weapons on the Vietnamese rebels, and Eisenhower more or less hung up on them. I'm going to drop nukes in a jungle because you guys didn't think of bicycles. Okay. As you well know, though, Vietnam, the story was not over. The French finally do grant independence. We have a similar story to Korea. North is mostly communist. South is mostly, again, not liberal. Diem was an autocrat. But he seemed like a nice guy. He spoke really nice French. He was Catholic. Could do business with. The Dulleses loved him. So you're our guy in Vietnam. He was very corrupt, not a nice guy in any stretch of the imagination. And there, Vietnam certainly becomes. When Eisenhower is leaving office in 1961 and handing over to Kennedy, they talk about Laos, which is next door. But Vietnam was not really seen, again, the story that we just talked about in Korea, not that big a deal. It's mentioned, but kind of in passing. It's not seen as one of the national security priorities. But by the time Kennedy's assassinated and LBJ takes over, by 64, 65, we get dominoes. We've got to be sending tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of American troops to defend South Vietnam. Why? Because if South Vietnam goes communist, all of Southeast Asia will. Okay? We know from history it didn't happen. Maybe because the costs were so high or whatever, but so on. Okay, very briefly then, Guatemala in 1954 has a government, and in this case, the Arbenz government is talking about socialism. They do want to have socialism to a degree that hadn't been seen really in Latin America up until that point. And similar to the Nasser story of nationalizing the Suez Canal, or the Mossadegh story of nationalizing Iranian oil, Arbenz says, wait, we have all this agriculture that we're growing, and our farmers and farm workers are making nothing. The big profits are going to American companies like the United Fruit Company and so on. We would like to grow our own fruit on our own soil and sell our own stuff and have our own profits and commies! And the Dulles boys, again, go into action. This is communism, now not thousands of miles away. This is, hey, Monroe Doctrine, right? This is the Western Hemisphere. It's right down the road. Communism right there. Can't have it. And the CIA Eisenhower approves a whole series of covert operations, including assassinations and covert so it's airplanes that don't have U.S. markings, but they're being flown by American pilots who are, working for weird companies with weird names like the Central American Commercial Air Wing or something. They're CIA employees and so on. And again, with the idea, and no one will know it's us. Everyone knew it was the United States. It really was a really poorly kept secret. Because in a way, the CIA wanted to make sure that the communists knew the lengths they would go to prevent communism from spreading itself. 1959, you have Castro in Cuba overthrowing Batista. Cuba was not a colony, neither was Guatemala, but again, basically Batista was an American puppet. Cuba had its own flag, had its own currency, it was independent, but the Americans basically told him what he could and couldn't do, and he was fine because there was a lot of money for just kind of following instructions. So Castro overthrows. Castro also, at some point, had approached the Americans and said, will you help Cuba do all the Bill of Rights, constitutional stuff? And they said, no, we've got a good program already. We're good. And so Castro didn't start off from day one as a communist. He started off as a rebel who didn't like this kind of corrupt system. And again, he turns to the communists. This really puts the panic now in the United States. So when Eisenhower is handing over to Kennedy, Cuba's a big one. And for those of you who have studied a little bit of history, while that handoff happens from Eisenhower to Kennedy, Eisenhower has already approved a covert mission to invade Cuba, which eventually is a horrible disaster. But he tells Kennedy, I've authorized this, me, Ike, Eisenhower, I've authorized it, but we weren't ready to launch it. You're the president now. You have to decide whether to go for it or not. At which point, Kennedy and his new advisors ask about the mission and, well, kind of get lied to. It happens. about how prepared the invasion force is and how easy it will be to keep American involvement out. At some point, Kennedy basically says, if we do it, we cannot have any American personnel involved, any American planes. It's fine that we've trained and equipped Cuban exiles to kind of retake their own homeland, but we've got to stay out of it. And it turned out a key part of the operational plan is if we don't have air cover, we don't go. And so there's a big fight there. Okay, I'm going to stop. I think I've gone too far. Algeria, very, very quickly. But the one because I found a quote actually this morning that shocked me. I've been studying this for a while, but it was the first time I had seen it. Algeria was not technically a French colony, it was part of France. It was France, it just happened to be on the other side of the Mediterranean. Alaska is not a colony, or in Hawaii, they're just not connected, they're not contiguous, but it's not a colony. Guam is an American colony. Puerto Rico is an American colony. Alaska is part of the United States proper. Algeria wasn't a colony, it was part of France proper. The Algerians started off not wanting independence, wanting equal rights. If we're French, then treat us as French. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, including us, kind of. And so at some point, equal rights turns into, well, if we can't get equal rights, then it's time to separate. Kind of like the American Revolution. Treat us equally. No. Okay, then we leave. Okay? It's a little more complicated than that, but similar. So I just found a quote that one of the French colonels fighting against the Algerian rebels, we're talking about dominoes here, makes the claim that what the fight is about is the freedom of the West. The Algerian rebels must be destroyed to protect the West's freedom. Now that was a series of dominoes I just had never kind of come across in such stark terms. Okay, so Congo. Why were the Americans and the Soviets there in the first place? And now let's have a kind of discussion, and I will, have why isn't this just between the Congolese? Why is anyone else even there? Yeah. Uranium. Okay. Why not just buy it?
You could get it from Syria. You could get it from Italy if you have it.
Okay. So have it meaning colonizing.
Yes.
That sounds awfully expensive and difficult. Yeah.
Well, the Belgians left immediately. They planned on...
Some of them.
Yeah. They planned on a 30-year leave. Mm-hmm. And then, in a conference in January 1960, the UN decided it's going to happen this June. So, most of the Belgians just left, and there began a mutiny in the army against the whites who did stay. Now, the problem was that they had a semi-presidential system, which means that the president and the prime minister both have almost equal abilities.
Okay.
We'll call it that. And one of them both of them were very displeased by the UN peacekeeping force that, for them, didn't do enough in order to suppress the secession of Katanga and of South Kasai. So one of them reached out to the Communist Party, to the USSR, and the other one, which didn't find it necessary, reached out to the US allies. And that's where the problem began, and it was simply an invite for both of them. Just come in here and make this one.
Okay. How did this crisis kind of turn out? Who do you think was happy about what ended up transpiring? Mobutu. Yeah. He's in power for what? 30 years? 35 years? Works out well for him. Anyone else? Yeah.
Americans, they got uranium. Most of their uranium comes from
Okay. Yeah, in most of the kind of official accounts of the Congo crisis, as it's called, this is a success from the American standpoint. It was very low cost. Really no American, almost zero loss of American life. But what's the big success? I've just been talking for 45 minutes on it.
Winning over the...
No Soviets!
The domino.
Yeah. No, we kept the domino from tipping. The Congo did not go communist. They could have, right? It could have gone differently. The uranium's going to the Soviets. The Soviets have helped one of these kind of decolonial, liberation, national liberation. This would have been a huge feather in the Soviet, this would have been a great victory for them, but it didn't happen. Who loses in addition to the Soviets?
The Congolese.
Yeah. Country's basically, a basket case. Immense corruption, hundreds of thousands of lives lost. Yeah.
You can basically say this would cause the Rwandan genocide because of this. Years later, it happened.
Now we're back to a few dominoes. Yeah. 30 years later. So yes, it is part of the story. As far as it would be an awfully indirect cause, but there would be a lot of intermediary things that had to happen in the meantime. After all, Mobutu in power still has choices, right? It's one thing to say, I'm in power and the Americans support me. Great, but he still has choices how he rules. The United States never really said, as far as I know, all right, we'll support you, but only if you're a total bastard. Only if you oppress and squeeze your own people to an inch, that wasn't part of the condition. But it also wasn't part of the condition, we'll support you, but only if you're nice. Right?
It was nice. It was very creative.
I think you're being creative. Mobutu was nice?
He took my character's eyes out with a spoon.
But nicely, gently, with anesthesia.
He hit the spoon beforehand.
What a darling. So, I think one of the things that hopefully comes out in the story that I've been telling of the Cold War is, in addition to this kind of zero-sum thinking, if it's bad for my enemy, it's good for me. It's not the right way to think. There are certain circumstances. If I am a boxer in a ring with one opponent, every punch he lands is truly bad for me and good for him. But geopolitics, international security, does not really fit very well or very often the logic of zero-sum. What's bad for them is good for me. There are cases. And so, for example, when I go back to this 1949 period where the Soviet Union tests their first nuclear weapon, there are zero-sum thinkers with 4 stars on their shoulders. The top generals in the Pentagon are telling Truman and then Eisenhower, we must launch an all-out nuclear attack on the Soviet Union immediately. We must. To protect the United States. The longer we wait, it's only going to get worse. Right? If it's good for them, it's bad for us. If it's bad for them, it's good for us. Now, luckily, presidents along the way kept saying, that doesn't sound right. I get how it would be bad for them, for us to attack them with all of our nuclear weapons, what I can't understand is how that's good for us. Right? So inflicting pain on him, I got it, that's bad. But what do we get out of the pain on him? I don't really get it. Okay? So the zero-sum thinking, it's tempting. It's simple. It's easy to remember. You don't even have to write it down. If he hates it, I love it. Got it. But if taken to the extreme, I think leads governments, countries, corporations to pursue paths that end up hurting themselves in the process. Okay? The other is dominoes. And dominoes, you know, if you have the creativity, you can see dominoes connected to almost anything. Right? So this French colonel who's looking at Algerian rebels who are asking for crazy things like equal rights are threatening the West's freedom. And so what's the answer? How do we protect the West's freedom from people asking for equal rights? Let's use torture. Wait, what? Yeah. I'm going to protect the West's freedom by torturing people who are asking for equal rights. It happens. Okay? So if again, individuals, groups, governments, countries, alliances, get so swept up into dominoes and zero sum, wow, lots of really bad ideas can all of a sudden sound not only good, but necessary. Not only can we, should we must. We have to. Okay? So I think the United States in the Congo crisis very quickly goes from Lumumba doesn't want the Belgians here anymore. Wait, Belgians are our NATO allies. You don't like our friends? They're our friends. You don't like us? Now you don't like us? And if you don't like us, you must like this. You are communists. Now it turns out that there were plenty of intelligence analysts at the time in 1960, inside the United States government saying, Lumumba's no communist. He's not a communist. He's not interested in communism. We have no evidence of any communist. But once it gets up to the Dulleses, you're either with us or against us. Don't sound like you're with us. You must be against us. Okay? And I think what happens, I'm going to get to you in a second, I think what the pattern I tried to lay out is I think there were multiple examples in the Cold War. I focused on kind of the U.S. and the British and the French. The Soviets made their own mistakes, trust me. Of kind of, not only do you end up pursuing self-defeating policies that impose costs on yourself, you miss opportunities, right? Castro wanted America to help him basically export American values to Cuba, and the American answer was, go get lost. We already have our guy, he's Batista, we've been paying him off for years, why do we need you? Ho Chi Minh wanted America to help him import American values, capitalism, and so on, to Vietnam, and the answer was, go fly a kite, or whatever the Vietnamese equivalent. So once you start thinking in these zero-sum domino, it blinds you to the opportunities that are there in front of you when people are coming to you to cooperate. Say, wait, you're not on my list of people I've been bribing. That means you're not with, that means you're against me. I'm not interested in helping you. And so we don't know. We don't know really what would happen. History doesn't work that way. You can't rewind the tape, try a different input and see how it works out. There's no control group. There's no alternative universe Vietnam where we can go back and go, we'll work with Ho Chi Minh and let's see what happens. And maybe we won't have a Vietnamese war. Maybe we won't have Pol Pot, which is a very close domino that I'm happy. Maybe we won't have 4 million civilians slaughtered. Now, is that all the fault of that one? When that person, that American diplomat has Ho Chi Minh in front of him saying, will you help us? No one can also roll the tape forward and say, and if you don't help us, we're going to get Pol Pot and 4 million civilians dead. You don't know. You don't know the longer-term ramifications of those policy decisions at the time. But throughout the Cold War, throughout this decolonization period, time and time again, we have examples of people who were seeking the path of nonviolence, of cooperation, of true kind of human economic development, who wanted to take the right path and were basically told, sorry, not interested.
So America